we've had conversations about creativity. This is the 4th annual conference now, and I know that is it last year that you took part, or was it a year before that?
I think it was, time moves so quickly. I think it was the year before, I think. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Okay, so over the past 8 years, I've been exploring creativity, and the research that I've done in terms of creativity research over the past 70 years, since the 1950s, most of the research is I can broadly categorize it into themes which can be clustered around what I call the 7 P's of creativity. Like some researchers focus on the people aspect, the creative people, and they explore questions such as, well, who is creative, who is more creative, what is it, what are the skills and characteristics that make one person more creative than another. And the second P, product, the questions are around what is creative and what is not creative. And here the debate is around, does creativity have to be valuable, or does it only have to be unique? Is something which is original creative even if it has no value? Some people think that creativity has to be valuable for it to be defined as being creative, because otherwise the term becomes meaningless. And the third debate is around the process of creativity. Some researchers focus on, well, how does creativity arise? And they focus on the techniques, the strategies that make creativity more feasible, more effective, more easily to generate. And others focus on the pressures around creativity. What is it that destroys creativity? What undermines creativity? How can we avoid undermining creativity, especially in education? And then another theme is around place. What creates a conducive environment for creativity? What enables creativity to thrive and to flourish? And another P is about persuasion, and this is to do with the gatekeepers. Who evaluates creativity? Can we say that something is creative just because we believe it's creative? We've created something and we think it's creative, or do we not have to go through the gatekeepers, the experts in the field, who will say, you know, from an objective, impartial point of view, whether that merits being identified as being creative or not? And then the seventh P is to do with permanence, that when something is truly creative, innovative, it usually leaves an indelible mark. For example, Facebook, it was an innovative form of creativity, and there seems to be no going back. It's led to a transformation which has, you know, changed all our lifestyles. And this year we're focusing on another P, presence. And this time I want to explore what presence means to you. And this presence can be both physical, it can be virtual. Like now, we're not physically present with each other, but it's a virtual presence. And presence can also be metaphysical. Presence can be an idea, it can be a slogan, it can be a story. And, you know, for example, the coronavirus pandemic, it's not, we might not be in physical contact with this virus, and yet it's created such an upheaval and turmoil in our lives in a complex way, even though there is no direct cause and effect relationship, perhaps, you know, if we're not touched directly with it. Nevertheless, it's led to the emergence of new, you know, it's created an impact which has led to a turbulence. So let me start by asking you, first of all, what does presence mean to you?
Really good question. Presence, I guess for me it would be, depending on the context that I'm in, or that I'm operating within. So, you know, referencing and having online presence, so you can be very prominent online, in social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, and have that kind of presence. You can be very media present, in terms of what you communicate, and being in a public eye, and having a wide platform. In terms of the work that you do in, say, engagement, you can be very present in that sense. For example, you can be a facilitator, a trainer, or an organizer, and not be very, very present. And you can be present, and in that space, I guess presence would be being engaged in what you're doing, having a vested interest, and communicate that vested interest and that passion in that sense. And I guess in the context of creativity, I think I may have touched on this before. I kind of see creativity as a transmutable energy source, as in it's applicable depending on the user and the intent of the user. So bringing it right into this very presence, being present, say here, is having an awareness of the subject matter, being fully engaged, and making sure that my engagement, my interventions, my language is congruent with the focus of whatever it is that I'm doing. So I do think it operates in that way.
Yeah. So I suppose you're alluding to imagination. You imagine the outcome that you want, and you want to be in integrity with that vision that you have. That you're holding that vision for that outcome.
Yeah. I think it's somewhere. I think it's a transition from. So I guess it's conceptual, and it's you could argue kind of creative visualization in one sense. But what makes it presence is what it's grounded in. So if I come into a space, whatever field that I'm working in, and I come from a space of what I perceive it to be and a concept, I'm not really present, because I'm operating in a space that I've generated personally. And I'm a big believer that your mindset and your perception determines your experience of things and how you engage. So if you operate off of your premise, which will inevitably be a bias, be it an internal one or one which is new, you don't actually engage and you're not present, because you don't see what is before you. You're always met with the perception of what is before you, and that can actually, dissipate nuance and real presence and engagement.
Right. So in the work that you do, tell me a little bit about the work that you do and how you personally ensure that you are present and passionate in the work that you do.
Okay, very good question. So I work in a multifaceted way. So if I put it in tiers, one aspect of my work is around community engagement. So it's looking at infrastructure which facilitates healthy environments and healthy behaviours fostered around youth violence, supporting parents who have faced trauma, creating strategies for young people to make better choices and to think about the thinking behind their thinking, and how that then impacts the choices they make, and therefore their quality and experience of life. That's one element of what I do. The other element of what I do is looking at how bias informs how you engage with a diverse spectrum of people, from ethnicity to gender to age to mobility, and how you can build an inclusive culture based on inclusive leadership, but also then how that translates into practice and group dynamics and behaviors, and how people work together, and then how that translates into the thinking behind infrastructure and how you design and implement those systems. And that's very much on a kind of more of an infrastructure level. So it's looking at either corporate leaders, government, local government, non-profits. It's really about leadership and how you make a change, integral change from infrastructure.
And how important is it for you to be physically present? Like with the coronavirus pandemic, we haven't always been able to be physically present in the work that we do. So shifting from that physical presence to virtual presence, has it made any difference?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so although we're doing this call now, in terms of engagement, most of my work will be very intrapersonal and interpersonal, where I'll either be in a room with a group or with one person or with two people, having that narrative. And therein the transformations begin in terms of behavior change and perceptions. A lot of my work is done over the telephone, which is also what I've done a lot of. But in the space of video conferencing, it changes it, because the nature of the engagement is very different. And what I've found I've had to do is adapt some of my attitude to the work that I do, and my mindset around engagement. So it has impacted on my work. Ironically, I was busy in life anyway, but as COVID descended upon us, I became even busier, from an infrastructure perspective, in terms of what the callings were, and then also from a remote perspective. So I've kind of evolved in that context, and learn and I'm learning to communicate in a video medium. And it's very different in a social sense. In a social sense, there are things you don't need to consider, but in a professional capacity, there are many things you need to consider.
And you talk about infrastructure. Do you believe that when we change the infrastructure, our presence changes?
Yes, I'm a big believer in that. So we operate in systems, and social contracts. So society is a social contract, which we adhere to by law, but we buy into consciously and both unconsciously. So the infrastructure creates the boundaries of that infrastructure that we operate within. It creates the visual prompts, the actual legal prompts, and the behavioral prompts. So we are inadvertently, subjectively, influenced by those things. So if you can change the thinking behind what that infrastructure is, you therefore facilitate the change in behaviors. But it's both sides. So one change in behavior is working with the individuals, the people, because society is people and organization is people. But then it's the infrastructure, because those are the frameworks we operate within.
And that leads me to the question about the fact that a large percentage, or an overly disproportionate percentage, of people who were adversely impacted by COVID are BME people. And a lot of people would say that's to do with the infrastructures, the systems, that has created it, rather than the fact that people from BME origins are naturally predisposed to being more adversely affected. So that doesn't say very much about how we've evolved over the last 50, 60 years, since we've arrived in this country from different places. It doesn't say very much about our evolution in terms of belonging in the infrastructures.
That's a very, very good point, and you're quite right. And I know, extended members who've kind of been adversely affected, and relations and things like that. I think that there's an argument that whenever there's any kind of social crisis, that those who are most marginalized are hit the hardest, by the virtue of being the most marginalized. And I think there's a truth in that. Equally though, is the virus intelligent enough to single out specific groups? And it's for example, in BAME communities, diabetes might be prevalent, but that might be more about cultural diet and different things. And what I actually think is that in terms of say health issues, I think that a lot of the BAME individuals were at the forefront, on the front lines of dealing with COVID. So that is definitely a factor. In terms of the rest of it, I think that if you're in a marginalized group, your access to healthcare, to the benefits of the maybe the best support, best service is somewhat diminished, as it would be generally. And BAME people are a minority, so even if we might be individually successful, or someone, a prime example, President Obama was the president of arguably the then most powerful country in the world. However, that didn't stop, consistent attacks and disproportionate stops and killings of black people in America. So yes, I think that it does say a lot in terms of what the actual evolution is, and that there is still a long way to go.
Yeah, so presence is also to do with like exactly where we're located in those spaces, in that infrastructure, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so unless those structures change, our behavior, regardless of how differently we behave, it's not going to make as much impact because the structures are still the same.
Absolutely.
So in terms of making an impact,
absolutely,
absolutely,
and it is about. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to think about, like, in terms of the impact that you want to make in your work, like working backwards, how would the presence need to be different? Because it's all a feedback loop, isn't it? So presence, emergence, impact, and the impact feeds back into the presence. So my question was going to be, working backwards, how differently would you need to shift your presence in order to make the impact that you're aiming for?
Very, very good question. So my thinking at the moment is very much that I'm having to arguably have more of an online presence. When I say arguably, I'm by no means have an expert in the field, but I'm just choosing to have more of a presence. And often with my work, most of my work, 99% of my work, is through word of mouth, and through people hearing about me and relationships and that type of thing. So in me kind of, I wouldn't say promoting, but having more of a presence, it's making me, where the currency changes, so it's actually making me have more of a presence in this medium, where it's more remote and it's more online. But that being said, I haven't been pushing a big marketing campaign, and I'm trying to be quite nuanced about it, because I'm a big believer in, I don't want to kind of, for want of a better term, become fodder. You can go online and you can find a million things and people that do the things that you do, and there's room for all of it, but I'm not trying to be a part of that narrative. I want to do what I do, having a conversation at a time, a relationship at a time, and that's the intent behind my kind of approach to being present. And I find that works for me. I think that's important, that you evolve to work with the current context and climate, but you don't change the position you have in terms of the practice and the values and your organizing principles.
Do you think that the virtual environment is a more level playing field in terms of our presence? That, in the physical structures, very often we're fighting against glass ceilings or concrete ceilings, and trying to push against the boundaries, whereas the virtual environment, arguably, is there a concrete ceiling and a glass ceiling in the virtual environment too?
Okay, really two good, interesting points. So first point I'll address is the online presence. So in some ways it's a level playing field, but it's all about do you have the finances to have a real competitive, or what's the word, outstanding, or eye-grabbing campaign. So the more resources you have, the shinier the product, right? So if you've got a whole whole finance infrastructure behind you and a whole, corporation, your online presence will be incredibly powerful, incredibly consistent, and incredibly targeted, and incredibly stylized. So that kind of gives you an edge in that vein. Is it a level playing field in terms of everyone has capacity to do that? Yeah, it is, because if you can then get the finances or have the right team, you can create, But again, it just makes it a different type of competition. So I'd say 50-50 on whether it's level. In terms of pushing against that glass ceiling, I think that the narrative for me is almost knowing that the glass ceiling exists, but then pretending it doesn't. And I remember many years ago, I'm just not to digress too much. I did some work with an educational institution. I'm from a student, and he was from Afro-Caribbean slash kind of Asian descent, and we were talking to get ready, talking about leaving school, and he said, "Well, I need to work twice as hard because I'm at the bottom." And I said, oh, I'm not sure what you mean. He said, "Well, being identified as a young black guy, I'm kind of in terms of society, I'm at the bottom." And I said, "Well, it's very important that how you see yourself is different to how others may perceive you to be. And if you perpetuate an idea, it becomes a reality for you. So don't misunderstand me. We all know racism exists, systemic racism exists, and there are still so many boundaries that you face as a member of the Bain community. That's a reality. But look at it like this. If you live in the jungle and you know that there's a well at the other end of it, you have got tigers and snakes and all that to navigate. But what do? Do you stay there and die of thirst, or do you get to know your terrain, learn to navigate it, and find a clear route to get in that water? Of course, you get the water because you want to survive. So it's not pretending it's not there, but actually that doesn't define you. The idea of who you are persists. The reality of that for yourself. If you understand your climate and then say, okay, I'm going to work within this infrastructure, but my goal is beyond this. If your vision is, I call it beyond victory. So you're always taking steps and making decisions which move you further along, but the end goal is beyond what is presented to you. The end goal is something of your making, and that evolves with you as you go on your journey.
Yeah, that's so true. And the word navigation is very often used in talking about racism these days, because it's all to do with how we learn to be skillful navigators through the systemic racism, rather than perpetuating the myth, perpetuating these false perceptions, as you say, because again, it's that feedback loop. If we expect racism, then we will behave in a certain way, perhaps coming across as being defensive when there is no need to be, and that makes others treat us maybe more harshly because we're being defensive, and so that vicious cycle continues, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So it's getting the balance of the two. So it's important that you carry an idea. I've travelled a lot with my work to places where often I am the only BAME individual, only black male, and my mindset is that I'm traveling to an extension of my home, and what I mean by that is I'm a human being first, and without being ignorant of borders and cultures, and actually I'm a citizen of the world, and any boundary is a pseudo, it's political, and of course we need them in place, but that doesn't have any implication for me as a human being. So when I travel to a place, my mindset is that I'm coming to an extension of my territory, and I think that translates. So I carry myself as if I belong there in my mind, and I think that impacts on the kind of quality the interactions I have. That being said, that isn't a signal to say, racism is isn't there, you need to know that's not true. Racism is very, very prevalent, and I face it on a daily basis. But my modus operandi to combat that is to understand it, understand its root, understand its origin, but also be very clear about who I am and what my purpose is, and to be quite grounded in that. And that gives me that that capacity to be mobile across many different areas.
That's right. And so again, our presence, our somatic presence, in terms of like sometimes being the only person who looks different racially in an environment, that presence can cause all kinds of unseen dynamics, right?
Absolutely. And it's also how people receive you, because there is an idea of how a particular person should be. If you don't match up to that idea, it can throw people off center, because of course through media representation and education, there will be an idea of what a BAME individual is, what black male is, what an Asian woman is. So if you don't meet that criteria, it's what's happening here, and then it's a learning and a journey for those people. And you may have narratives which refer to, oh wow, you don't fit that stereotype. How did you do that? And it's because a stereotype is a fallacy. Essentially, whether you're African, Asian, South American, you're just a human being, and we all have the same behaviors. There are none unique to a particular group. Now, proportionately, say for example with crime, in a marginalized group, crime will be prevalent, but the nature of that crime will be reflective of the context and dynamics. If you're in the less marginalized groups, crime will be prevalent, but the nature of that crime will be pertaining to those conditions. So we're all doing the same thing. So a human being will always fit a stereotype. The issue is the perception that that person is unique in that behavior is the issue.
And also our presence in isolation can be very different to our presence in groups, in mass. For example, Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter, just even the slogan has a presence now. It has power. There's power in that slogan. So people don't even have to be gathered together. Just the slogan or just the gesture, the symbol, the taking the knee, just that actual symbolic gesture of taking the knee has power. So the presence of that, again, it's like, it doesn't have to be tangible, it doesn't have to be physical, it can be even metaphysical, like George Floyd's death. That's a metaphysical presence that will
absolutely. Absolutely. Ideas and ideologies are very powerful, also very, very, very dangerous as well. I think in terms of Black Lives Matter, if this had happened 2 years ago, the impact would have been less. As in, we've seen footage of people being killed, all that kind of stuff before. The response has been refined, and it from perspective where, a building in France burns down, everyone's upset. Stuff that happens to animals, everyone's upset. Brexit, everyone's upset. But often when it comes to the issue of someone Black being harmed, it's a bit quiet, because suddenly it's not so transparent. The interesting thing about Black Lives Matter, specifically George Floyd's death, is that I think it's significant that it was in this COVID period, because the response has been, I've been quite taken by the response, because it's been international and it's brought different world leaders to the fore. And actually, it hasn't been a predominantly BAME movement. Actually, I'd say it's been quite balanced, and even on occasion, depending on the climate, say outside of the States, wherever, leaning more to having more of a non-BAME presence. And that's important, because the issue isn't within the BAME community. The infrastructure of racism isn't created and perpetuated by BAME individuals unless they subscribe to the ideologies of it. So the conversations they do need to happen in communities outside of the BAME. So I've been quite impressed with that, and I think it has become that powerful of a pull. And of course, the normal things happen where it makes people uncomfortable for different reasons, and you get different things and different factions and all kinds of debates and controversy around things. But in essence, it's a very simple message, which is please don't kill me because I'm black, which is essentially what it is. So yeah, I agree. It's become quite a metaphysical. It's been an amazing trigger and catalyst.
And I think it had an impact because it blew away a myth. And the myth was that things are slowly getting better. And because it happened during the coronavirus pandemic, and we knew that 90% of the doctors who died, the nurses who died, were 90% of them were from BME backgrounds, that more than 30%, an overly disproportionate number of people were BME, low paid workers, etc. It's because that it happened in that context. It was like, no, things are not slowly getting better, and that's where it erupted. It's like it was exposed that no, just because we have a few people on TV that are from BME backgrounds, that creates a myth that, well, things are changing, but we forget that that's only a couple of people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and it's also, it comes back to the infrastructure, right? So for media representation, you may well think everything's okay, but if you really look at it, there's still the funnel to it, arts, performance, and sport. Now, there's nothing wrong with being in those areas, but it's not the sole area. But if in a wider sense, outside of the media, of course, if you look across every industry, there's prevalent, very, academic, scholars across, from every aspect of the BAME community, who are doing amazing things and have done amazing things, but that's not the narrative which is promoted. And also, again, from education, what we're taught doesn't reflect the diversity of the world. And when we do learn about other cultures, it's from perspective of when, relationships with Europe, when those cultures were at a deficit. So the world image perpetuates the idea and the ideologies of a particular group being better and more advanced than another group. And it's interesting because it's in our history, so it's in our time, but it isn't the full narrative. And if you look before that narrative, there's an actual real history which isn't Afrocentric or Asian centric, which is very, cultures and societies of the world being very prevalent, impacting society, being, pioneers in just about every area prior to the Renaissance, and the industrial age, all that type of thing. So, but that's not narrative that we get. So we get a skewed worldview. So you need to change the infrastructure from an educational perspective, change it from a political perspective, and change it from a corporate perspective. Otherwise, the behaviours are perpetuated. And I know there is movement there, and we have the Sustainable Development Goals, but and some organisations are further along than others. Some have began 10 years ago, some 5 years, 3 years ago, but it will be take some time to get there. But the drivers need to be more definite, because as you highlighted, it isn't all okay, it isn't moving well. It's still a long way to go because of those infrastructures.
Yeah, I mean, from the data that we see, it doesn't seem as though we have moved very far at all. It feels as though we're still living in colonial times, even though overtly the colonial structures are not there, but implicitly they are still there.
Absolutely, and it comes back to legislation. If you look at the states, legislation inhibits economic wealth being fostered, grown, and perpetuated in Afro-Caribbean, Latino, marginalized communities. It's actually legislation, And then when it isn't overt legislation, it's still ingrained because the infrastructures are the same and the thinking is the same, which is why it is levels and layers to it. So it's the thinking behind the thinking, and then the systems that emerge from that thinking, and then the behaviours that emerge as a result of those structures.
Absolutely, yes. So it's the philosophy of philosophical ethos and how, our starting point. It's like, as you say, the thinking behind the thinking. It's that intent. What is the intent? And who's the protagonist? And what part do we have in the story? Are we the protagonists, or are we the victims? Are we, the marginalized? And how do we come from that point of being marginalized? How do we take the initiative to not be marginalized, to have more of a presence?
Absolutely.
Final points then, Talmud. So in terms of presence, emergence and impact in relation to your own work, how would you summarize this concept of the feedback between these three elements?
So I would say clear intent, and clear purpose. Because how you communicate, what you communicate is very important, and you want to make sure that the message is received and that it's clearly understood. And even if it isn't, the essence of it is understood. And sometimes complex things need simple delivery, because we do live in a very we live in a fast information age, and even just having a mobile phone, we get into the culture of just having quick access very fast, to the point where we get impatient in things that take more than 5 seconds. When they're loading things up, so things move very fast. So it's communicate complex ideas initially very, very simply and straightforward, and then from the narrative of the relationship conversation, having then the space to get into greater detail. Once you kind of made that connection, it's being consistent and innovative, and having a clear understanding of what you're trying to do, but not working from a premise of people fitting into your way of working. It's important to engage with people and then be present in the space that you're in and be receptive of those people and the nuances that they bring, and not deviating from what you want to do, but understanding that it needs to be applicable to the context that you're in. And like education, everyone moves at a different space and engages on different levels. So you need to have that diversity of approach to be able to, or be open enough to facilitate that different level of engagement. And I guess beyond that, I would say it's the action, it's making it happen. So it's always, I always feel that something needs to happen, because sometimes start the conversation's healthy, it creates a debate and it gets the thinking happening, or then you move conversation forward. What happens next? That's the tricky part, because people are happy to have a narrative, but where's the buy-in, where's the commitment? The next part is to actually get the buy-in, so let's make something happen, and then it's actually making it happen. And it's that action which is quite important, because the action can be superficial. If the first part hasn't happened, it can be a superficial action which ticks a box but doesn't really do anything. It needs to kind of be more well received and integral to whatever's going to happen. So conversation, mindset, nuance, behavior change, innovation, and then action, reaching a goal, making something actually happen.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that summary. That's excellent. Lots of nuggets of wisdom then.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
Then